Kira and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be talking you through all of the books that I managed to read throughout April, but before we get into that, can we just take a moment to talk about where on earth April actually went? I went into April in lockdown thinking that the month was going to be so long and that I wasn't going to know what to do with my time because it was going to be so weird not going out to work, not going out to socialise, to cafes or anything really, but in actual fact the month just went by so quickly and I don't really know how the month flew by so fast, but regardless, it was a really quick month in my opinion, so let me know if you agree, if that happened to you as well, or if it was just me having a bit of a weird month, but I just can't believe how quickly April flew by. But moving back onto books, I also had a really good reading month because I managed to read a total of 11 books, which is such an amazing total for me because normally I'd say average around 5 or 6 books a month, and then if I have like 8 books, that's a really good month. So to have reached 11 books in one month is a big achievement for me and I'm super happy about it, especially because throughout February and March I feel like I was in a little bit of a reading slump. I think I read maybe like 4 books in February and I think 4 books in March as well, so I just really wasn't finding that much time or motivation to pick up any books, but for some reason I seem to have just been able to get rid of any of that reading slump throughout April and I'm so happy that I managed to read 11 books. So without further ado, I've got a lot of books to talk about, so maybe grab a cup of tea or coffee and get cozy because I love a chat and this is probably going to end up being quite a long video. So without further ado, let's get into the books. So the first book I picked up throughout April was actually for a buddy read that I was doing with a few friends, Emma, Carolyn, Lucy and Mary, and we all decided to read The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. Now I didn't really know too much about this book going in and hadn't really ever intended to pick it up, but Emma suggested it as a buddy read and I was really excited to see what it was all about and just get into it because I didn't really know too much other than the fact that this was a Greek myth retelling, and I've only ever read one other Greek myth retelling, which was Circe by Madeline Miller, and that was incredible, so I really wanted to get into some more and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to do that and also be able to talk about it with my friends as well. So like I said, this is a Greek myth retelling and in particular this one focuses on retelling the story of the Iliad, so it takes place around the time of the Trojan War, and in particular this book focuses on giving some attention to some of the lesser known or lesser explored narratives, and in particular female narratives that didn't really get as much attention in the original story, which I just think is such an incredible thing that has come out of this culture of Greek myth retellings, because I think it's something that seems to happen in quite a lot of these retellings, and I just love that it's sort of giving attention to those narratives that didn't get as much focus in the original stories, which I just think is so much fun. This one in particular focuses on our main character Briseis, who is from Troy, and she's quite a sort of rich and well-off woman, but she is taken during the Trojan War by the Greek army and ends up being Achilles' bed slave. The book essentially just focuses on her experience of this brutality and everything that she faces during her experience as a prisoner of war, all of the atrocities her and all of the other women who were taken face, and it's just a really brutal and upfront narrative which focuses on all of the horrific things that happened during the war. But I also found this book to be really interesting because I think whilst the main focus of the narrative is on Briseis and her experiences, we do also get a significant amount of the book which focuses on Achilles and Patroclus, so some people who we would consider being sort of on the side of our protagonist to be the enemy, and yet we get to know them in such an in-depth way that you start to recognise that who you view as the enemy and who you view as the sort of good guys really does depend on your own personal experience. And of course there'll be people in the sort of Trojan side who would be viewed as the villain by people on the Greek side, and I feel like it's just a really interesting way to explore the fact that there is never such a simple thing as the good guys and the bad guys, and it's always far more complex, especially in the instance of war where things become so much more political and it's just really difficult to know who is the good person and who is the bad person, unless of course you're looking at the people who are the real victims of the situation, such as Briseis, who have no opportunity to really get involved with the situation as females at this time of history, and so they are of course the real victims. But I think when you start looking at the people who were involved in the actual fighting, it becomes so difficult to judge who is good and who is bad, because it really just depends on where you're from and what sort of situation you ended up in, but there is no real way to sort of define goodness and badness in these situations, I think, and I think Pat Barker does an incredible job of sort of exploring that sort of moral greyness that comes up in war and how it can be easy for like literary narratives to sort of paint one side as good and one side as bad, but actually this book really explores the fact that that's far more sort of blurred than like most narratives would let us believe. Now, having discussed this of course with the people I was buddy reading with, a couple of thoughts did come up which I definitely agree with, which sort of centred around the fact that this book was called The Silence of the Girls, and yet a significant amount of the narrative wasn't really dedicated to these female experiences and did actually focus on the experiences of the soldiers and Achilles and Patroclus, which I found really interesting, but I do agree that that could be something that you'd be maybe disappointed in if you went into this book solely expecting a book which focused on telling those untold female narratives. And I do think that is maybe something that it would have been better to have a little bit more attention given to Briseis and potentially some of the other females who were taken as bed slaves and prisoners of war as well, because of course their stories are so interesting and so important to learn more about. But overall, I loved this book. I ended up giving it 4 stars because I don't think I loved it quite as much as I loved Circe, and just in general there were a few sort of flaws like I just explored. But overall I think this was an incredible book, and I think the way that it explored the atrocities of war with such an upfront and brutal writing style was just so incredible, and I did really enjoy this one. And having actually read it, I saw on the back cover there was a little bit of an author bio, and it turns out that Pat Barker is from Yorkshire like me, which I thought was just a little fun fact to go along with this book, and I did really enjoy it, and it's always fun to read local authors as well. So this was definitely a good start to my reading month. Next up, I picked up Emma by Jane Austen, which I absolutely adored and ended up giving 5 stars. Now, this was the first Austen I'd picked up in quite some time, and the reason I wanted to read it was because I'd been intending to go to the cinema to see the new Emma film adaptation that came out in February, but of course now all of the cinemas are closed and I haven't actually been able to watch it yet, even though I've now read the book. But as soon as it comes out on Amazon and it isn't extortionately priced, I'll definitely be watching that because I've heard incredible things about this adaptation. But pushing that to one side, the book in and of itself was just so good that I loved it so much, and I think this is actually my favourite ever Austen. Now, as is the case with pretty much all Austen novels, this is a romance-focused book, but I feel like this is a romance with a little bit of a twist because we're not necessarily always focused on the romance and love life of our protagonist, because Emma, at the beginning of the novel, our young protagonist, essentially sets herself up as a little bit of a matchmaker, and she's really interested in setting up other people and finding these perfect matches. And actually she doesn't necessarily have that much interest in pursuing any romantic interests herself. So it's kind of a really interesting and slightly different way to explore romance in this sort of 18th century setting, which I really enjoyed, especially because it's a very funny book and Emma isn't necessarily as good of a matchmaker as she originally thinks she is, and she makes quite a lot of blunders along the way and manages to make quite a few mistakes in a really funny way. Now, of course, we are interested in the romantic life of Emma as well, but I think the way that it kind of takes a little bit of a backseat for at least the first half of the book makes this a really interesting and quite unique book of its era, and I just really loved how it set up a very comedic style of romance, which I just thought was amazing. And I also think Emma as a protagonist is incredible because she's so flawed. Like I said, she's already a bit of a Cupid gone wrong in the sense that she thinks she's a much better matchmaker than she actually is, so she's definitely flawed in that way, but she's also a very critical character. She's judgmental, she doesn't necessarily like everyone, and she can be a little bit snobby and conceited, and overall, although she is a really nice person in general and people tend to like her, she also does have plenty of character flaws, which I think is completely natural for someone of her age. And just in general, people are not perfect and people do judge other people and don't necessarily like everyone. And I think of female protagonists again of this era, it was very common for them to have to kind of be, you know, perfect and entirely moral and just absolutely amazing characters, whereas I think by having these flaws, Emma becomes so much more relatable, and I just absolutely loved her, and that is kind of the main reason why I think this has become my favourite Austen novel, because I just think Emma is so funny and so relatable, and I just loved it so much. So the next few books I picked up were actually for part of a 24-hour readathon that I did in collaboration with my friends Meg and Em, and we basically all decided it would be fun to send each other some of our favourite books. So I was sent one book by Meg and one by Em, and then I sent one to each of them, so we all ended up with 2 books, and it was just a really fun way to read some of our friends' favourite books. And the one that Meg sent me was one that I was a little bit nervous to get into because I'd never read a book of this style before, and that was Heartstopper by Alice Oseman, which was my first ever graphic novel. Now, I had never been interested in really picking up graphic novels because I wouldn't say that they're really my thing, but I do love Alice Oseman as an author, and I have really enjoyed all of the novels of hers that I've read, but it was just not necessarily something I'd even really considered picking up when it came to graphic novels. And to be fair, I still don't know if I'm really into graphic novels as a general concept, but this one was just really nice because I love Alice Oseman and her writing style, and I just think that really came across in this book. So in this book, we basically follow two young boys who are in high school together, and they have recently been put into a class together, and they don't really know each other all that well. We have Nick, who is kind of popular and he's like very sporty and considered very cool, and then we have Charlie, who is a little bit more of a loner and has currently been dealing with some cyberbullying. And these two boys start to become closer and closer, and eventually they start to consider whether or not they're interested in each other romantically as well as friends. And it's just a really, really cute and light-hearted story about friendship turning into romance, and it was just a really, really fun read. So I'm glad that I picked it up, and I'm glad that Meg sent it to me because I probably wouldn't have read it otherwise. So I'm glad that I sort of delved into the world of Heartstopper, and I think I am definitely going to continue on with the other few volumes of this series because I want to see how it ends. But I'm really glad that I picked it up, and it was just very cute. On the little package that Meg sent this book in, she described it as a hug in a book, and I think that is the perfect way to describe it, so thanks, Meg. And then moving on to the book that Em sent me, which was a very, very different vibe to Heartstopper, but enjoyable nonetheless. It was Beartown by Frederick Backman, which was another 4-star read for me, and this was probably a little bit more up my usual style of reading, and I'd actually been intending to buy myself a copy of this one when Em's copy arrived, so I was super glad that I hadn't bought it and ended up with 2 copies. But I did really enjoy this book because it was very, very interesting and quite a thought-provoking read. This is a book which takes place in a town called Beartown in Sweden, I believe, and it's essentially a very small town with not much going for it. It's got a shrinking population, and the only thing that really sort of brings any vibrancy to the town is the sportsmanship, and in particular the ice hockey team that is based in this town. And because of the fact that they're kind of like the main thing going for the town, the players in this ice hockey team are considered to be kind of like gods in the town, and they're given so much respect, and just like they're adored by everyone because they are kind of like the opportunity for the town to gain life and vibrancy and just opportunity, and they are sort of really, really essential to the town prospering and having any chance of sort of coming back from the steady decline that is sort of seen over the years. And then aside from this hockey team, the other primary focus of this book, which is mentioned on the blurb, is an event which essentially divides the town in half. We have people who want to push this event to one side, hush it up, and just kind of forget that it ever happened. And then we have people who want to fight for justice, and that is kind of the primary focus of this book, or so I expected going in. But in actual fact, although this event is described on the blurb, and therefore I expected it to be a really prevalent factor throughout the entirety of the book, the event doesn't actually take place until about halfway into this book, and this book is about 500 pages long. So you're reading the book for about 250 pages, waiting for an event to happen because you know it's going to happen because it's been mentioned on the blurb, but it doesn't actually take place until halfway in, which I did find to be a little bit irritating, because that means that the first half of the book really does just focus on setting up the town, all of the residents, and essentially just focuses on hockey and this hockey culture that the town sort of is based around. And whilst I do recognise that that sort of building up of this culture that the town is based on is really important for understanding which side of the divide people fall into, I also do think that if you're going to mention something on the blurb as the main event of a book, it should take place, I'd say, probably no later than 100 pages into a book, because otherwise I feel like you're constantly waiting and you don't really feel like the book has really started until the event takes place, and so that's half of the book where you're kind of just waiting and not really feeling like you've fully gotten into the story. Now, without giving away any spoilers, because of the fact that this event doesn't really take place until halfway into the book, it is a book which focuses on trauma and sexual assault, and so I feel like that's something that people should probably be aware of going in, particularly given the fact that it doesn't necessarily fully mention that on the blurb of the book, and it's not something that you necessarily are expecting until it happens halfway in, and I feel like it could sort of take people by surprise. So that is kind of what the book focuses on, and I won't really say too much else about it other than the fact that I think once the event does take place, the way that it explores it is extremely frustrating but also very accurate in the way that it explores the fact that although this is an event that people should just accept is wrong and should sort of want justice to be done, there are those people who think other things are more valuable than justice and who don't want to accept the truth or face up to what's happening right in front of them. And so I think this book deals with it in a very accurate and really, really incredible way, and I think it's very frustrating to read because of the way that it deals with it, but I think that's really important for conveying an accurate and sort of realistic experience of the topic that's discussed. So although I was slightly annoyed by the book in the fact that it sort of mentioned this event but it doesn't take place until halfway in, I think the way that it then eventually does deal with that event in such a realistic and upfront and quite sort of devastating way throughout the book once the event has actually taken place. That's why I ended up giving it 4 stars. I did knock off that 1 star just because I think it was kind of crazy how long you had to wait for the event to actually take place. But I think once that event had happened, the way that Frederick Backman deals with it and writes this narrative is really incredible. And even though it was slightly irritating to have to wait so long, I still would really recommend this book. I then had time to squeeze in 1 more book for this 24-hour readathon, and I actually had a book on my shelves that Em had sent me at Christmas time that I was obviously still yet to read, so this seemed like the perfect opportunity to finally get around to it, and that was It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover, which I knew was one of Em's favourite books, but aside from that I didn't really know anything about the narrative or what I was getting into. But I'm so glad that I did pick it up during this readathon because I loved it and ended up giving it 5 stars. So this book is a romance, which I think is what Colleen Hoover is known for, but she writes romances that may be a little bit darker, which I think is incredible. And although this was my first ever Colleen Hoover book, I definitely think I'll be reading more of her writing in the future because I think she does the perfect sort of combination of romance with those darker topics, which is something that I really enjoy. I don't necessarily love books, contemporaries, romances, or any genre really, that are super fluffy. I like things to have a little bit more like grit and depth to them, and this book did that perfectly. As I said, this is a romance, but it is sort of taking place on a dual timeline, which I absolutely love. Obviously, I've said this so many times before now, you're probably all really bored of hearing me say it, but I just think any book that either has a dual timeline or a dual narrative style just is so incredible, and I'm almost certain to enjoy those books because I think they just give so much more context and depth, and they just really round out a story that I just think is so incredible because you either find out more about other characters and understand various perspectives, or you start to understand more of the contextual and historical information that has led characters to where they are in the present moment. And I just think it's so important for learning more about characters, and I've never read a book which has used that narrative style where I felt like it hasn't added something extra to the book, so I just absolutely love it, and that was an amazing start to this book. So beginning with the present day narrative, we focused on our main character Lily, who is in her 20s. She's living in Boston, and at the beginning of the book she meets a guy called Ryle on an apartment rooftop, and they end up hitting it off because they just have really great chemistry and they get on really well together, but they don't really want to pursue anything romantic with each other because they both want very different things from any sort of romantic pursuits. Lily is someone who definitely wants to pursue that sort of classical husband and kids and just like long-term relationship style of relationship, whereas Ryle is someone who doesn't really want to pursue that. He's into one-night stands, is very busy with his career as a surgeon, and doesn't really want to pursue anything other than sort of very short-lived and fun-focused romances, and he's not got any interest in pursuing a long-term relationship. And so although they hit it off and get on really, really well together, they decide to sort of go their separate ways and part because it doesn't make sense to try and pursue something when they want such different things from life. But gradually, as this present day narrative continues, we see these characters continue to cross paths and chemistry continues to build, and we just see them gradually sort of come in and out of each other's lives in various ways, and we see this relationship gradually build as they start to interact more and more in various circumstances. So that's kind of where our present day romance takes us. And then we also have a historical romance which focuses on Lily when she was 16 years old and her boyfriend at the time, Atlas. Now for me, Lily and Atlas's romance was my favourite part of this book because I just think it was so wholesome, but also was just really sad, and I just loved the way that it played out. Now, Lily and Atlas went to the same school, but aside from that, they didn't really have much interaction with each other because they were in different years and didn't really have any reason to interact with each other. But one day, Lily starts to notice that Atlas is sleeping in an empty property near her house, and she realises that he's homeless. And because of this, and the fact that he has nowhere to wash or clean up or change clothes, he's also suffering with being bullied at school, and no one really wants to interact with him. So Lily starts to try and be a sort of source of kindness in his life. She offers him some food, some shelter, somewhere to wash, and just starts to become a really good friend to him. And gradually this sort of blossoms into a romance which is just really lovely and wholesome and just so cute to read about. Now, because of the fact that Atlas comes from such an unstable background, they end up having to go their separate ways as he has to leave to try and join the army and just try and make a better life for himself because he sees that as being his only prospect. And so Lily is left behind and they don't really have any further interaction until at one point in the present day narrative, in the Lily and Ryle romance, Lily bumps into Atlas and that part of her life is reignited. And that is essentially this trifecta of romance that this book is based around, and I just think it was so incredible. This book deals with the concept of toxic relationship, the pattern of abuse that can occur when people have dealt with domestic violence in their young years and how that pattern can consistently repeat itself. And I just think the way that this book interweaves romance that can be really light and fluffy and wholesome with some really dark topics in such an incredible way, and it can tackle the subject of domestic violence, of toxic relationships and all of those things, and do it in such an incredible way was just amazing. So I loved this book. So the next book I picked up was actually a non-fiction read, and it actually ended up being my favourite book that I picked up in April, which I was so surprised about because I really don't read non-fiction books very often, so to have one that ended up being my favourite book of the month was definitely a surprise for me, and that was Educated by Tara Westover. This book is a memoir which details the life of Tara Westover, and her life is incredible to the point where when you're reading it you actually start to think about whether or not this is a fiction, because the things that she experiences are so wild and out of the realms of anything that I've ever personally experienced that it's hard to believe sometimes that this is based on a real life experience. But it is, and it is an incredible story. Tara Westover was essentially born into a very religious, cult-like family who were essentially prepping for the end of the world, and because of that they really don't trust the government and they associate the government with the devil, and for that reason they have chosen not to register their children, Tara included. The children don't go to school, they don't have medical records, they don't associate at all with Western medicine, and essentially they just lead a very, very religiously inclined life which focuses on becoming self-sufficient and making sure that they can survive the end of the world. Now, from the blurb of this book, I understood that Tara was eventually going to leave this situation and go on to get an education and make a life for herself outside of the world of her family. But what I expected from this book was a bit more of a cut and dry experience of sort of deciding to leave and then going on to move on with her life elsewhere. But what I actually got was a much more complicated book, which really focused on how difficult it might have been to make that decision. And it actually really challenged my perceptions, because I just kind of thought it was just going to be like someone deciding to leave a cult. But then this book actually kind of made me realise how much more gravity there is to a decision like that, and how much more complicated it is to actually initially make that decision, start to consider it, and then follow through with it, and all of the difficulties that come along with that. Now for Tara, what I think is so interesting is that we see her start to have these two different existences, and she sees herself as the Tara who is getting an education and the Tara who wants to build a life for herself, and then the Tara from the farm where she grew up, the one who's prepping for the end of the world and who only understands the world through the view of her parents. And of course we start to see her really struggle to reconcile these two very disparate experiences, and her struggle to understand which way of the world is the correct way to view it, and sort of reconcile what experiences that she's having, the various ways that she's been told to view things by her parents, and then the way that education actually leads her to start to view the world. And we see it as a much more complicated sort of web of education, emotion and knowledge, and we see her really struggle to figure out who she is and how she is able to view the world. And of course this book being about a family really focuses on how emotion plays into Tara's experiences and how she struggles to understand whether or not education or family is more important to her, because in her situation it becomes clear that through education she's going against what her parents want, and so by choosing to pursue that lifestyle she's also essentially choosing to move away from her family and to cut ties with them in a lot of ways, and she starts to try and figure out whether or not there's a way to reconcile the two things together so that she can have a connection with her family and also pursue an academic lifestyle. And so it's a really, really complicated book that sees Tara going back and forth continually and really struggling with her decisions, struggling with her identity and not really knowing what to do. It's a very powerful story, really emotional and just so impactful, and I just think it was incredible, and I would highly recommend everyone to pick this book up if you haven't already. The next book I picked up was one that I've been meaning to read for quite some time now, and I'm so glad that I finally got around to it because it was another 5-star read, and that was The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which is of course one of the most well-known dark academia books out there, and like I said, one that I've been meaning to read for a long time. Now I've heard very mixed things about this book, and I know a lot of people end up DNFing it because they say it is boring and very slow-paced and they just couldn't get into it, but for me I absolutely loved it. This is a slow-paced book which doesn't necessarily have a huge amount of action, but I absolutely loved it because I felt like it built up so much tension and mystery and really allowed you to get to know all of the characters. And I know for some people that can be really dull because people like a lot of action, but I personally prefer it when you really get to know the characters in so much depth and you can really understand the intricacies of the characters, and I just think that really adds to a book for me. So this book was ideal for what I wanted from a book, but I could kind of see why other people wouldn't enjoy it, but for me it was incredible. This is obviously a really well-known dark academia. and it is set in a very prestigious New England college, and particularly it focuses on a group of students who are being led by this very eccentric professor who teaches ancient Greek and allows them to sort of study the classics in a very unorthodox way, and he is basically the only teacher that they're allowed to have, and so they have a very like sort of cult-like experience with this professor, and they have this very prestigious academic learning experience which kind of differs from everyone else at the college and is very, very unique to these few students. In particular, we focus on our protagonist Richard, who comes to this college from California. He's not from a very privileged background, and so this world of classics and eccentric professors and very sort of tight-knit groups of students is so sort of otherworldly to him, and it is really interesting to enter the book following him as our protagonist, because I feel like as readers we get that same experience of being sort of indoctrinated into this world and figuring out all of the mystery and darkness that lays within all of the layers of this story. And I think by sort of entering with a protagonist who doesn't really know what he's getting into, we get a much better experience of figuring it out along with him, which I really liked. Now, at the beginning of this book, we're essentially told in the prologue that a murder takes place at some point in the story, and then the rest of the book essentially builds up to this event and then follows the aftermath. And aside from that, that is kind of like the main event of action that takes place in this book, and the rest of it is very slow-paced and character-focused rather than plot-focused, which I absolutely loved, and I think sort of drip-feeding the fact that there is a mystery and a dark event that's going to take place, and then just gradually leading up to it and building all the tension around this event was such an incredible way to tell this story, because I do think it was really fun to sort of know that that event was going to take place and yet not know exactly when it was going to be, and you know exactly what's going to happen, but you don't know all of the circumstances and context that leads up to the event. And I just think it was an incredible way to build mystery and to hook you into the story, but then you don't know exactly how all of the characters are going to be sort of affected by or involved in this event, and it's just so interesting, and it just kept me hooked all the way through. I absolutely loved it, and I read this one as part of the stay-at-home reading rush. I'd been intending to read 4 books in one weekend for that reading rush, but I ended up reading this one for most of the reading rush because it was definitely a very sort of information dense book, which I don't think it would be possible to read in a really, really short period of time, in my opinion, because I just think you really need time to soak in all of the information and to get to grips with everything that's going on. But I loved this book so much, and I'm definitely going to be reading more Donna Tartt, but I just can't imagine that she's going to have anything else that is this good, because this was such an incredible book for me. I did manage to read one other book during the stay-at-home reading rush, which was Reasons to Be Cheerful by Nina Stibb, which I did really enjoy because it was a very light-hearted and fun book, which I ended up giving 4 stars. This book is set in the 1980s, and we follow our protagonist Lizzie, who has just left school without any major qualifications and doesn't really know what she wants to do with her life, but she manages to get herself a job as a dental assistant and also gets the flat above the dental surgery, and she basically is just starting her life, finding some independence, moving away from her very eccentric mum who's very artistic and a little bit out there, and just starting to figure out who she wants to be, pursue some romantic interests, and just sort of like start her life as an adult. And it's just a very fun and light-hearted coming of age story. But then the book does also deal with some much more serious topics, which I think kind of hit you out of nowhere, and that makes them even more impactful for me. In particular, this book deals with the issue of racism in the 1980s, and we see the dentist that Lizzie works for abusing his position of power to turn away patients in need just based on the fact that they are people of colour. And we see Lizzie as a young girl who is in a relatively powerless situation in this circumstance, trying to sort of figure out how she can take a stand against something that she knows to be wrong. And we see her sort of wrestling with this issue throughout the book and trying to take a stand against something that she knows to be unethical and that goes against her morals. And then aside from that, the book also deals with a few other issues, including the issues of grief and also alcoholism. So although overall it's a book which does have quite a light-hearted tone, I think that Nina Stibb does a really good job of weaving in some more serious topics in a way that makes them very impactful, especially against the backdrop of a more light-hearted narrative, because I feel like that makes the really serious issues stand out a lot more. But overall, I really liked this one. I'll probably read some more Nina Stibb in the future because I really liked her just like fun and light-hearted writing style. And it was also fun to read something set in the 1980s because I don't think I've ever read anything set in that era before, so that was fun too. So April for me was clearly a month of readathons. I was taking part in the Owls Magical Readathon right throughout the month. I also took part in the stay-at-home reading rush, like I said, when I read The Secret History. I did a 24-hour readathon with Em and Meg. So as we got to the end of this very readathon-filled month, I thought, why stop now? Why not just try and fit in at least one more 24-hour readathon to push up that reading total and try and read as much as possible for April? And so I did one more 24-hour readathon in which I read 3 books, which of course brought my total up to my final book total for April of 11 books. And I thought, why not just make it a little bit of an extra challenge as well, and not only just try and do a 24-hour readathon, but try and read an entire trilogy in one day. So you might have already seen the reading vlog for this 24-hour readathon because it has been up for a couple of weeks now. But the books that I'm talking about that I picked up in one day and finished an entire trilogy of was, of course, The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. This was the first time I'd ever read the Hunger Games series, and so I'm super excited that I finally ticked this one off my TBR, and even more excited because the reason I picked this one up was because the prequel is coming out in the middle of May, and I was so excited to get on the hype for that one and actually read it along with everyone else. But of course I wanted to have actually read the Hunger Games to begin with, and I'm so glad that I did because these books were all 5-star reads. Although to be honest, I did leave this series and 24-hour readathon experience not really feeling like I'd read 3 separate books, because I read them in such close proximity and they are obviously all part of a trilogy that it kind of just felt like I'd read one huge book rather than 3 separate ones. And so I am just going to quickly talk about them all together rather than as separate books, because in my mind I don't really know where the lines are between all of the books because I didn't take breaks in between them and it was just one very Hunger Games filled day. Now I feel like this is a book series that is so popular and everyone has either read the books, seen the films, or just heard everyone talking about it, so everyone kind of knows what happens anyway, and I don't really feel like I need to give too much explanation. But essentially this is a post-apocalyptic dystopian style book which is set in Panem, which is essentially the remnants of North America, which has been turned into 12 separate districts which are all run by the capital, who are like the political leaders of this universe. And these 12 districts are all sort of pinned against one another in various ways, and they're all used by the capital for very different sort of means. Some of them are more agriculture focused, other ones are used for mining, there's fishing districts and all kinds of things, and they're all basically just used for their services that they can provide to the capital. And then one way that the capital sort of maintains their control over all the districts and keeps it so that they don't interact with one another and have a very competitive spirit is by running an annual Hunger Games. And essentially this is basically just a fight to the death between children, and there are 12 different districts, as I said, and each district gives up 2 tributes, 1 boy and 1 girl, between the ages of I believe like 12 and 18, and they're basically taken off into this games and sent to fight to the death, and whoever is the last tribute alive wins, and their district is essentially rewarded for their winning with extra food and funding and all of that fun stuff. So basically it's just a very twisted way for these political leaders to maintain their control over the districts. And at the beginning of the first book, our protagonist Katniss Everdeen volunteers as tribute in order to save her sister, who was picked out of the random draw, who was only 12, so the youngest person that could have possibly gone into it. And so Katniss decides to try and save her sister from this horrible fate and takes herself off as tribute and ends up in the Hunger Games, and that is essentially where the series kicks off. Now of course this is a YA dystopian series, so there's definitely a lot of romance in here, as well as a lot more serious action and political stuff as well. And I just really liked how this book had such a good blend of romance and friendship as well as action and politics, and I just think it was a really, really well done YA dystopian. I would say if I was to separate the books and say which one I preferred, I'd say The Hunger Games was probably my least favourite just because the plot was the most basic and it was predominantly just focused on the actual Hunger Games themselves. Then I'd probably say Mockingjay was my next favourite, and then Catching Fire, which is the second book in the series, was definitely my favourite just because I feel like it had the perfect blend of politics and character development with action, which is just absolutely my favourite recipe for a good dystopian. But just in general, I think the series overall does a really great job of building up this very political world with an undertone of revolution that really starts to bubble in the first book and then kind of like erupts as the series goes on. And I just think it's a really, really interesting story. We also see some amazing character development with characters like Katniss, who starts off the series being just very like focused and kind of like emotionless and just very, very goal oriented, into characters that have a lot more emotion and complexity and start to really understand the nuances of the world in which they live. And I just think it's a really, really interesting book. Like I said, I love the blend of romance, friendship, action and politics, and I think the way that this book deals with politics and shows the gradual bubbling and spread of this revolution right throughout the 3 books, up to the point where it sort of like culminates in a massive kind of like eruption of sorts in the final book. I just think it's so well done, and I think because I read it in such close proximity and read them all one after the other, it just felt like such a tense reading experience, because you really did feel that like bubbling up of tension right throughout the series, and you started to see these characters start to understand the control that the capital has over them and the depth in which that control goes to and how far they would go to hold on to that power. And it's so interesting, which has made me even more excited to find out more about the political system and about President Snow in the prequel, A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, because I'm so excited to read that in the middle of May. But yeah, loved this book, it was brilliant, and I'm so glad that I've read this series finally. So that brings my wildly long April reading wrap up to an end. I feel like I've been talking for hours and hours about these books, which probably isn't true, although this is probably going to be one of my longer reading wrap-ups. I just think having had 2 4-book months in February and March, I'm a little bit out of practice with talking about this many books all in one go. So I hope this has been interesting and that you've enjoyed hearing about all of my thoughts on all of these books. I can assure you that my May reading wrap-up won't be anywhere near as long as this, because let's be honest, there's no way I'm going to hold on to this reading pace for 2 months in a row. It's just not going to happen. So I'm sure we'll resume back to normal programming with like a 5-book month in May. But for now, if you've read any of the books that I read in April, let me know your thoughts on them, if you thought the same things as I did, or if you had any different thoughts on them. And if not, let me know which was your favourite book that you picked up in April. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.